He had two birth defects that should have meant his demise: blindness and a missing leg, which caused his owners to believe he was. He was abandoned by worthless in a distant field, but 5 years later, the tables turned, transformed in unexpected ways. How could a crippled dog abandoned to survive in a harsh environment not only endure but also show up as a surprising source of courage and motivation on a brisk autumn morning as a little trembling? A puppy was discovered whining in a tea grass patch close to the town's boundary. Weakened, suffering from hunger and cold, and lacking a whole leg even more. Tragically, he seemed blind, with glassy blue eyes that showed no awareness of the stranger who had found him. A young volunteer with a local rescue organization carefully picked him up from the stranger. The puppy, who weighed hardly more than a handful, appeared to have been abandoned shortly after birth, and word swiftly traveled among. The volunteers discovered a handicapped dog that was missing a limb and blind. Many shook their heads in agreement, muttering that instances like this didn't usually end well. Some assumed a family had attempted to care for him, but the person who produced him decided he wasn't worth the vet fees, but thought his specific demands were too much to handle. In any case, the heartbreak lay. Despite all odds, he was left to die without having the opportunity to demonstrate his ability to love and live. When the time came, a kind foster named Lillian came forward with determination. Some of her friends were perplexed by her decision to provide Denny, the puppy she named, with the safety and love he had never experienced. Why spend so much money on a dog who is so underprivileged that many people thought he would never live a normal life? Denny's first. The weeks he spent in her house were terrifying. He would crash into furniture and struggle to stay balanced on 3 legs. However, every time Lillian came close, she only needed to catch a glimpse of his wagging tail to warm anyone's heart. A handicapped puppy, yet a glimmer of hope for this first rescue. But it's just the start of a 5-year story that would question preconceived notions about people with disabilities. Karma appeared to have designs of its own, yet compassion and the ability of an underdog to change the perspective of an entire community. Unbeknownst to those who rejected Denny, their icy deed would start. A series of events that would come full circle in unexpected ways, from a scrawny, abandoned whelp to a dog whose spirit refuses to give up, and Denny's narrative is one of triumphant calm defiance. How his survival became a blessing that changed many people's lives, and a sobering lesson for those who witnessed him. As Expendable is still a story that is best explored gradually these days. After welcoming Denny into her little house, Lillian soon realized how difficult it is to care for A. The first challenge for a crippled puppy was to make sure he could move about without being hurt all the time. Being blind meant that every furniture piece and corner presented a risk of collision. Hence, the absence of one leg meant that balance was a constant challenge, and even a short walk could turn into a whimpering, awkward stumbling ordeal. Frustrating attempts to make forward. Yet in the midst of these difficulties, Denny showed where many pups would have cowered or displayed symptoms of timid submission. He displayed an incredible amount of perseverance and radiated a lovely. He was persistent, pausing each time he ran into a chair to collect himself and begin again, feeling out the edges of his surroundings with a blend of smelly sounds and cautious palm movements. The more Lillian observed him change, the more she realized that he was not a person who gave up easily. Practical solutions became. She started using foam to cushion sharp corners and moving furniture to make wide pathways as part of a daily quest. Positioned softly jingling bells in strategic locations so Denny could use their gentle chimes to orient himself and confront his missing limb. She sought advice from a veterinarian with knowledge of canine prosthetics, but despite the overwhelming expense, she would not acknowledge that she put in more hours at her. Despite some neighbors' initial skepticism, Denny's part-time work was determined to pay for any assistance he could require. Occasionally, a small letter with a few cash would show up at her door, allowing her to observe her dedication. Another wave of solidarity arrived during feeding times when anonymous gestures suggested the silent support that was growing around them. Denny, who was blind and unstable, had trouble finding his bowl and maintaining a stable posture during his first meal. Food was spilled, and Denny continued to pour helplessly despite the mayhem. Leland created a feeding station that used textured mats to line the floor and directed Denny's nose to the precise location, so that he could detect when his pays were properly positioned. In just 1 week, he had adjusted surprisingly quickly to each little. Triumph exuded a feeling of achievement that warmed Lillian's heart, demonstrating that for all his limitations, Denny had a strong desire to study, but not all. Lillian heard him whispering to some friends or rescuers, which encouraged his progress. Volunteers questioned Denny's sustainability in the long run, claiming that money would be better used on healthier dogs each time. Although she never struck out, she had a peak of rage because she could relate to their practical point of view. But beyond practicalities, she felt a connection with Denny that permeated every action he performed. The ability to successfully navigate a new area of the house was a triumph against the cruelty that had deserted him, and she felt in her heart that Denny was under her care for a reason. And as time went on, Denny's self-assurance increased, and he became proficient at distinguishing between tile and carpet, which meant the texture of a particular rug in the living room and kitchen revealed him the root of his water bowl outside. Greater obstacles. But Lillian brought him to her fenced-in backyard so he could smell the air and feel the lush grass beneath his. Despite his stumbles, he nevertheless delighted in the novel sense of the one-step porch, which was formerly a dangerous obstruction, gradually transformed into a ledge that could be overcome. A habit of sniffing at the fence's edge to create a mental map of his domain. Yet this development incrementally astounded Lillian, causing her to cry repeatedly while observing Denny wag his tail in response to the sounds of birds overhead, a straightforward joy that no one had anticipated for a three-legged blind dog. People who had previously avoided adopting special needs began to hear about the miraculous pup from the local rescue network. When animals started paying attention, Lillian started receiving calls from families who were interested in the prospect of providing Denny with a long-term residence each time she paused, while the last aimed to place him in a caring home where her attachment was unquestionable. How could she make sure the adoptive parents fully understand the subtleties of Denny's day-to-day existence and his dependence on? Each talk concluded politely because to the subtle clues and textures communicated. Thank you. But she didn't make a permanent commitment because she knew no one was really ready to. As she fought for his needs, the issue of who had deserted Denny remained a source of pain for her, with reports circulating that a local breeder had thrown away a litter of puppies with birth defects or that, although there was no concrete evidence, a distant relative of Denny's original owner had seen it being dropped off in a rural area. Appeared, and instead of dwelling on the brutality of the past, Lillian decided to her enthusiasm into encouraging the prosthetic specialist to examine if a modified limb may improve Denny's balance. Despite being blind, he uses sophisticated puzzle feeders to keep his mind active. In the rescue circles, Denny's metamorphosis had become something of a small legend as month 3 drew near. Ridiculed the idea of healing a canine with such serious disabilities, today told his story with wide-eyed admiration. Denny's positive attitude and Lillian's devotion are evident in the dog's constant smile. And resolute hop-step triumphed over cynicism like sunlight on a dull sky. But the true test was still to come. Nobody could predict how a dog would go from being an adaptable puppy to an adult with specific needs. Unfold, but with Lillian's persistent commitment and Denny's nose pointing resolutely forward, it appeared every day, the impossible got closer to reality, but they were unaware of the silent. The seeds of Denny's redemption were also laying the groundwork for cosmic vengeance against those who had previously tossed him aside would quickly become entangled in an unexpected turn of events that caused them to wonder how readily they had dismissed a life for the time being. But Denny and Lillian were blissfully ignorant of what destiny had planned. Route that would eventually demonstrate how, with love and patience, the underdog might overcome others' constraints put on him, and by the time Denny was around 8 months old, a distinct energy had entered Lillian's tiny house where the first several weeks had been filled with late-night feedings and doctor's appointments. Everyday life now settled into a more consistent routine, which was still difficult, but steadying with progress. The puppy was a healthy young dog that, in spite of being blind and lacking euphoric, had acquired the ability to move with almost amazing precision through the living room and outdoors. He was guided by slight changes in the texture of the flooring and was able to identify the soft chiming of bells hung near doorways. Lillian, for her part, felt the effort of having even become brave enough to ascend tiny steps with an ungainly but efficient hop. Her commitment between working long hours and doing the things needed to keep Denny's specific surroundings in good condition, ranging from carefully planning checkups to moving furniture if he displayed signs of confusion, was on the verge of exhaustion, but every time she thought about the idea that she could be in over her head, Denny would act in a way that gave her hope again. Perhaps he would carefully approach a new order or react flawlessly to one. Little triumphs like these helped her remember why she calmly and curiously calmed the anxious cat at the veterinarian's office. When she originally took him in, she had thrown caution to the wind. He wasn't just getting by, he was breaking every anticipation of a desolate dog, followed by interest in Denny's. Success rippled throughout the small rescue group, and volunteers who had previously thought he was beyond saving were now. Some people stopped by to witness the amazing change, while others just watched and inquired if Lillian needed any supplies. Watching in awe as Denny skillfully dodged table legs and moved between rooms, the local short videos of Denny clumsily leaping after Lillian were posted on Rescue's social media page. Many notes from outsiders were left in the yard by this dog's tenacious spirit. Lillian was secretly hailed as a guardian before she realized it. Hero proposals to adopt him also surfaced, but she stayed guarded and unsure if any prospect dive. Denny's new family genuinely understood his complex requirements, and the gradual expansion of his internet presence resulted in unanticipated. However, one frigid day, Lillian opened her door to a small local news station that had heard about his story. Discover a camera operator and reporter standing anxiously on the stoop, ready to film a heartwarming feature about a three-legged blind dog who refused to let his disability define him was apprehended. Guard Lillian was hesitant because she had never pursued fame, but the reporters, her excitement and sincere interest in Denny's development convinced her to concur. A week later, the article was shown, presenting Denny's story as a beacon of hope for everyone facing hardship. The result was instant messages of appreciation and an increase in adoption requests. While Lillian was grateful for this outpouring of support, she was unable to disregard the little gifts to help with future veterinary expenditures. Persistent concern that, as a result of exposure, Denny's original owners could reappear. Rumors had been circulating for months that someone might be a backyard breeder, had excluded any flawed puppies in order to protect the repute of their organization. Although none of the rumors had been verified, there was a possible dishonest breeder in their area. Weighed on her mind, friends reassured her that no one would come forward to claim a crippled dog that had been abandoned. What would they gain years later? But she didn't find comfort in that guilt-based reasoning. Unpredictable manifestations of grief or a distorted feeling of pride are possible. Ironically, Lillian grew increasingly concerned about the likelihood of Denny's success as a symbol of tenacity. Confrontation. She didn't want him involved in court cases or being exploited as a promotional tool by. Her deepest fear was that the people who had so blatantly abandoned him would appear with some fake sense of ownership. So she took care to get all of Denny's medical documents and microchip him in. In quiet moments, she made sure that local rescues understood his unique situation, occasionally gazed into his milky eyes, experiencing a rush of love and a slight sense of fear that the piece they had carved. Since the local station segment became viral online, Denny's fame expanded beyond the immediate threat. The tale was taken up by the well-known national dog rescue blog, County Lines Fair, honoring the unshakable guardian who stood by his side and the unstoppable spirit of a blind, three-legged dog. Families sharing tales of their own pets with disabilities swamped the nation with side comments. People wishing you well, or just expressing how Denny's journey motivated them to overcome personal obstacles. Overwhelmed, reading every comment with tears in her eyes, and feeling both thankful and slightly afraid of what the excitement would bring. Denny continued to obliviously tail wag as Lillian returned from work, despite the situation. Happy with everyday routines and eagerly sniffing new squeaky toys if anything, The intangible burden of their newly discovered fame only strengthened Lillian's determination to shield Daniel from society that, having previously thought he was useless, she wrote to an internet buddy who was employed at a sizable K-9 sanctuary out of state looking at available resources in case their circumstances become unstable. A friend told her that with the right conditions, many dogs with special needs can lead happy lives. But Lillian wanted to protect Denny from any outside forces that might take advantage of or hurt him, not find a new home for him. During this period of increased consciousness and watchful supervision, the seeds of karmic justice started to. Eventually, she learned from a nearby groomer that a backyard breeding enterprise had just. The groomer suggested that the organization responsible for the cruel acts might be the same circle that has been believed to have threw out faulty puppies, and all of a sudden, the rumor suggested a direct chance that the same individuals who had previously disregarded Denny may now be subject to judicial action for their repeated acts of cruelty motivated by a feeling of moral obligation and protective rage. Lillian discreetly collected all documents that could connect Denny's desertion to this dishonest breeder's stray information from notes from rescue workers who had overheard hushed admissions on the day of his discovery. Each component constituted a mosaic of suspicion, but no single strand constituted unambiguous evidence that she considered calling the police or, by involving the police, an animal welfare organization runs the danger of attracting attention from possible litigation or ownership claims. She weighed each possible danger against the greater moral imperative that would have resulted from these breeders' methodical disposal of. She considered the greatest way to serve puppies like Denny justice. Continue. Denny was blissfully ignorant of human machinations. He was blind and without a limb, but he was completely sure in, despite the world Lillian had created for him. He walked into the living room with unexpected grace every morning. He paused to tilt his head at the TV news, not caring that it would eventually feature a story that connected his karma, the name given to the criminals who left him, but was already in motion a gradual, unstoppable escalation to a clash that would not only validate Denny's tenacity, but also reflect a glaring light on those who had previously disregarded him as undeserving. Lillian's silent determination to obtain proof against the. She was given a fresh sense of purpose by dishonest breeders, but it was laced with. She would return home each evening after her stint in the neighborhood printing shop to meet Denny and the tiny collection of rescued animals that had gradually come into her custody, and after Denny was at ease, whether she was sleeping or occupied with his puzzle feeders, she had laid out a little assortment of messages, receipts, and a makeshift investigation was conducted using stray images found on the kitchen table. From a moment of his initial rescue, and from reports made by rescuers who had witnessed too many, when abandoned reject puppies turned up, gathering these pieces was. Lillian meticulously documented Denny's journey, starting from the day he arrived at the local rescue and ending with his. She had numerous veterinary appointments for specialized care, but she lacked concrete evidence linking. Some people remembered seeing a black van close to the fields the morning Denny was found, and they took him to the alleged breeder. Others claimed that, although there were no records left, a certain phone number had previously texted the rescue about unwanted puppies. The more she learned, the more she realized that hearsay by itself wouldn't be enough to win a case. The more it became obvious that the same shady organization had a habit of throwing away puppies that weren't considered marketable. As Lillian pieced together the clues, she was keenly aware of the. Due to the increased exposure around Denny's story, she occasionally received comments from strangers who lived far away thanking her for supporting a crippled canine who battled against the odds. A Midwestern woman wrote a sincere letter explaining how Denny's story motivated her to adopt a blind kitty. Yet despite all the love, these actions created a persistent worry that Denny's former owners may learn about his newfound fame and attempt to claim him. Whether with a twisted financial purpose or misplaced pride, the idea of such a situation marveled at Lillian's tranquility while Denny was happily shielded from these worries. If anything, he had never had a better life thanks to Lillian, a specialist in prosthetics, was able to fit him with a lightweight, soft brace that provided some kind of balance where his limb, but he frequently grumbled if it misaligned or snagged on uneven ground, so it wasn't an ideal solution. It created opportunities for a little longer walks and sporadic trips to the dog-friendly park along the river. Although blindness still required caution, Lillian discovered that he swiftly adjusted by using his sense of scent and the reliable indications she gave during one such excursion, a local. After recognizing Denny from the news program, the father and daughter went up to check if he was as amiable and he welcomed them to their delight with a soft sniff and a subtly wag of his tail. The daughter, who was maybe 10 years old, said, "How can he be?" Lillian grinned while squatting by Denny, who raised his muzzle as though sensing the situation, and said, "Happy if he can't see or run right. When a girl is around, he finds happiness in what he can accomplish rather than what he can't," she said. The toddler patted Denny's side quietly, and his eyes brightened at the tactile connection experiences. Strengthened Lillian's belief that Denny's tale merited more attention than whispers about a vicious breeder. He was living evidence that a dog's spirit could thrive in spite of the overwhelming obstacles that her conviction forced her to face. In order to take more decisive action regarding the evidence trail, she assembled a binder including all of the available testimonies from rescue workers with a chronology who had previously seen limping or nearly blind puppies abandoned in isolated locations. Some questionable text conversations that the rescue had obtained, as well as Denny's own medical records that indicated congenital abnormalities that could arise from subpar breeding methods on a daily basis. She became increasingly convinced that revealing the truth would stop many dogs from suffering the same fate that Denny narrowly avoided. However, the idea of entering a court case or public dispute troubled her, since she was afraid of reprisals. During these inquiries, both for herself and the dog whose susceptibility had previously been taken advantage of, unexpectedly, Andrea, an advocate for animal protection from a larger, after reading a series of internet articles on Denny, city nearby contacted. Several phone conversations, Andrea clarified that she had prior expertise assisting in the development of cases against unethical breeders, and she provided to examine Lillian's collected materials and determine whether they might create a convincing case for the local government or a humane society possessing legal power. Lillian's alleviation was evident for the first time. Instead of merely feeling silent rage over Denny's actions, she felt a genuine way to hold someone accountable. While advancements occurred gradually, Denny's daily existence advanced rapidly as he mastered new trick in response to gentle melodic chimes that signaled various commands. One tone for one to follow, and another to halt. The therapy dog training concept had started out as an experiment, but it went beyond Lillian's expectations, giving Denny a new degree of independence when traveling through unknown areas on an excursion. He faithfully followed the chime to a local festival, navigating through throngs without frightening onlookers. By the time they got back, some were taking pictures or asking about adopting animals with particular needs. Home. Denny's breathless smile spoke a lot about his happiness, but not all. One evening while Lillian was going through her mailbox, she discovered a startling email subject line regarding that blind dog. The message's brief substance was tinged with a hint of menace. "We know. Dogs like him were never meant to exist. So perhaps you should mind your own business because you obtained him from the area around the orchard fields." Shaken, Lillian gazed at the screen, only to see the message, "No name, no immediate danger," rang maliciously. So she told a friend in the rescue circle about it, and he recommended that she report it to the local police. Enforcement. Anonymous tips hardly ever happened, but Lillian, despite the impending danger, these individuals may continue to be observing after realizing the dishonest breeder tale was not a mere myth. Shadows. Lillian and Denny's evening routine remained rock solid, with the water bowl being refilled. She stopped worrying when she made sure he was wearing the appropriate harness for his quick walk around the block before bed. Every setback had taught her to be cautious when a neighbor's porch light frightened him, or if his prosthetic brace came loose. After all, if a blind three-legged dog could greet each other, then Denny had to adjust. Who was she to give in to worry at the quiet end of the day after a morning of wagging optimism? During the day, Lillian occasionally pondered how Denny's ex-lovers might feel if they saw him today, standing tall. Though using a brace and 3 legs, they're creating a meaningful life out of the void that they once thought was inevitable. It felt like the start of something new for them to watch from the shadows, as their cast-off puppy became a local inspiration. Yes, karmic retribution is the last step, which involves making them publicly known or pursuing charges. Remained unsure. But with each tail wag that refused, Denny's brilliant resilience. Lillian saw the silent roil of cosmic justice to recognize constraints. All that was required was a last. Lillian's existence with Denny was complicated by the flame that ignited it every day, but it also included new happy moments. She refused to let fear to control her, even though the anonymous, threatening email constantly plagued her thoughts. Overshadow the advancements Denny kept making as local interest and media attention dwindled over time. Routine changed back to a more tranquil rhythm, including short practice sessions with Denny's soft chimes and morning walks. Prosthetic brace, peaceful nights spent sleeping comfortably on a plush mat, and the soothing sound of Lily TV in the. Yet despite this apparent serenity, she frequently found herself looking out her front window onto the street, half expecting a. When she couldn't find anything, it could be a shadow even passing by or a sly person hiding under the porch light. Andrea, her new buddy in the situation, had received an alarming email that was nothing more than a threat meant to frighten her. Following a string of phone conversations, the animal welfare sector advised prudence, told tales of how some breeders who were exposed had turned to coercive means, but she also provided confirmation that no attempt had been made to officially contest Lillian's adoption of Denny, and that because of his microchip and verified medical records, any legal attempt to assert him would probably be unsuccessful. When she had free time, Lillian continued her silent inquiry in the midst of these undercurrents. She gathered scrolled phone numbers from tipsters while going through the battered folder of notes. Andrea assisted in cross-referencing old receipts from nearby feed stores with the transcripts of half-remembered text messages, providing them with information regarding unethical breeding practices in the region. It was a patchwork of circumstantial evidence, but a disturbingly consistent pattern of flawed puppies emerged. Congenital conditions, such as blindness or missing limbs, frequently manifest in deserted fields or along riverbanks. Every instance felt like a rerun of Denny's tale, with individuals who saw financial gain in. Parallel to this silence, there are flawless specimens and no value in imperfect ones. Denny himself continued to be the antithesis of despair in his detective work. Lillian opted to test brief, off-leash sessions in a securely gated area because the dog responded so well to the chime-based orders. She would stand in the middle of the grass in a section of her lawn and ring distinctive chimes to signal people to come or to stop and observe. Amazed as he used sound to go over hurdles and sent alone on some nights, became so at ease that he began to roll and toss on the grass, evidently feeling more independent with each tumble. Instead of defeating Denny's, it risked a little awkwardness and depicted a dog living with verve. Achievements rippled through the local rescue circles in soft waves, and sometimes a new visitor would stop by. Someone who had heard tales of the three-legged blind dog that can stand and virtually dance to bells. With a phone in hand and a camera in Lillian's yard, it's not unexpected that additional adoptions. Tees were used to ask questions, but Lillian turned them all down because she was positive there was nothing new. The specialized setting and careful attention to detail that supported Denny's and Andrea's well-being might be replicated at home. Agreed, implying that any change to Denny's secure environment could jeopardize his emotional and mental stability. Lillian felt a strange pang upon realizing that he was dependent on her in a very wonderful sense. As Lillian concluded a training session with Denny, a neighbor she hardly knew, one crisp afternoon, responsibility. The woman came with a worried, curious air from over the fence, lingering for a time before leaning in to speak. A damaged truck had been seen cruising, as if sharing a secret. Lillian experienced a chill rush as she heard rumors that the region was associated with people who were either scoping out houses or collecting dogs. The memories of the orchard fields where Denny was initially discovered sent shivers down her spine, of a black van close to that location and the email telling her to keep her distance. Even if it was only a rumor, such vigilance felt justified and was decided not to live in terror, so she discreetly shared her worries with the local police. Regarding a potential connection between the strange car and the orchard site, But the on-duty officer sounded empathetic, but acknowledged that without concrete evidence of guilt, there wasn't much they could do to ease the strain in Lillian's. She mustered a solid nod as she hung up, but her chest came back tight and suffocating. Denny limped over to her and softly pressed his muzzle against Cal's, who knelt down to massage his ears, allowing his calm presence serves to remind her the reasons behind her refusal to cower that night. After Denny finished the last of her chores, Lillian fell into. While browsing an online forum devoted to dogs with specific needs in her threadbare armchair, she came across stories of brave foster parents who have rehabilitated animals with lost limbs or eyes, and who have overcome threats and distrust to obtain better. While reading a particularly poignant essay, the similarities between her predicament and the regulations prohibiting home breeders were striking. Regarding a dog abandoned in a dumpster, she had a range of feelings, including sadness, rage, and a strong protective instinct. Denny realized that the path ahead might require more public advocacy that was not less spurred by the realization she came to. Out to Andrea the next day with a daring plan, a marketing campaign that highlighted Denny's story and served as a demand for stricter breeding laws if the shady operators who left him were attempting to scare. Perhaps the greatest offense for her was to attack and promote the idea that pets with special needs should be loved. Numerous canines like Denny need vigilant adoption, and dishonest breeders had no place in their community. Andrea, who was thrilled about this change, offered to assist in creating a press release and obtaining testimonials from them. Naturally, local rescuers who had saw puppies like Denny pass through their ranks gave Lillian tremors of fear at the idea of saturating more websites or even local news segments with Denny's visage. People who had attempted to silence her might be drawn to her by the spotlight, but each time dread threatened to paralyze her. She recalled Denny's unshakable faith and his radiant personality, which refused to be diminished by the mere prospect of. Her concerns were overridden by the desire to keep another puppy from being thrown away like faulty goods. So she and Andrea set the foundation for their planned public awareness campaign with a shaky heart but unwavering resolve. Minor events at the rescue center, brief pieces for regional magazines, and a social media campaign Denny would continue to be the kind, optimistic symbol of their message that an animal's value should not be determined by its disability, and that those harshness would eventually have repercussions, whether they be moral, legal, or, despite the unknown obstacles that lay ahead, Lillian discovered a newly blooming. Knowing that Denny's unlikely happiness in life outweighed any harm they had encountered gave them courage. Thus far, there was no cause for concern regarding their ability to complete the mission to its karmic crescendo, guaranteeing that those who formerly thought compassion had no place will be defeated by love and all its quiet resolve. For a dog that was born without a leg and blind, inspired by the choice to go public, Lillian and Andrea collaborated to create an awareness campaign using Denny's story that would not only Denny's success in overcoming hardship, but every day following her shift, she'd arriving home to Denny's well-known wagging story. I spent the evening creating social media posts and reaching out to volunteers and local rescue advocates who previously dismissed her blind, three-legged puppy as lost. Because Lillian was always touched by the idea that Denny was blissfully ignorant of these attempts while Denny snoozed next to her feet, occasionally prodding her knee, while carefully curating old images and hashtags. Using his muzzle, he seemed to be saying, "Don't stay up too late," reminded her that she had made a promise, whether it was verbal or not, and that she couldn't back down. When she decided to take him into her house, it seemed as though that commitment also applied to all other abandoned puppies. Due to ignorance or greed, the campaign started out small with a quick web post in a newsletter of a nearby rescue organization, quickly followed by a wave of touching social media messages featuring images of when Denny wore his prosthetic brace or avidly obeyed Lillian's chime-based instructions. A new generation of some adoptive parents of exceptional needs expressed their admiration and curiosity in their comments. Demands pets from furious readers who want those responsible for leaving Denny to die held accountable to surge of. Lillian and Andrea were encouraged to go farther by the public's empathy, writing a message to the regional humane society and local. Within days, Lawmakers are calling for tougher laws against backyard breeding. As the campaign spread beyond the neighborhood, a local news outlet picked it up and ran a brief, but Denny's name was once again brought to light by the powerful story about the blind dog who conquered the odds. Rumor mill where others who were supportive joined in complimenting him. But Lily also congratulated herself for this. She could hear eerie voices as she recalled the frightening threats that had previously crept in her email, but she resisted giving in to the fear that it was too late to go back. The more attention they received, the more probable it was that they would spur genuine change, while Denny continued to act with the same upbeat resolve that he had displayed from the beginning. Delighted about the additional appearances brought about by the campaign's popularity, he performed on leash each time Lillian presented him to new supporters' kids, particularly. Learned to approach cautiously under Lillian's watchful eye after detecting Denny's calm, welcoming aura. Blindness, they would whisper to him or pat him on the nose to give him sweets, amazed at how quickly he grew accustomed to their presence. Albeit occasionally, they felt uneasy about Denny's obvious. They were put at rest by vulnerability and unfailing kindness, but more prominence brought about the reappearance of darker whispers on social media forums. Anonymous accounts appeared mocking the idea of spoiling a crippled dog. Lillian initially wrote these remarks off as normal online abuse, but Andrea saw a troubling pattern in their tone, reminiscent of the menacing email Lillian had previously received. Messages made fun of the idea that Denny's flawed life could motivate anyone, even implying that everyone is worthless. Despite the condemnation of these trolls by the majority of observers, he would ultimately meet a horrible end. A reminder of how precarious Denny's safety was in the midst of these conflicts. An unexpected discovery was made by a mid-level researcher connected to the Humane Society to review the evidence binder that Lillian and Andrea had assembled by comparing phone logs and, after piecing together witness accounts, the investigator discovered credible evidence that pointed to a limited number of local breeders were notorious for discarding puppies outside of approved routes. The more as further information was uncovered, it became evident that Denny's experience was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of, possibly with criminal overtones. Andrea called Lillian late one evening with cautious enthusiasm. She stated that the board of the Humane Society is contemplating a thorough investigation to see if we can connect them to 3 or more. Authorities may have grounds for substantial charge relief in circumstances with direct proof. Lillian felt a mixture of fear in her chest, because she understood that entering the legal battlefield meant taking a chance. Conflict with people who aren't scared to use threats or worse. But it seemed like a long shot to make those who had condemned Denny to a life of pain or worse suffer the repercussions. Much needed dose of karmic justice, while rumors of potential legal action swirled. Every morning, under Lillian's guidance, life at her house proceeded with its usual mix of regularity and transient joys. To help his joints, especially the shoulder that took the brunt of his strain, Denny performed a mild stretching exercise. Leaning his head against her arm, he bore the weight with stoic acceptance. She decided to try experimenting with different textures by dispersing little floor mats and rugs with various weaves so Denny may refine his feeling of place. It nearly turned into a contest to see how fast he could spot mossy mat by the rear entrance or a rough weave by the kitchen. His upbeat answers told her that his drive to experience everything would not be stifled by any limitation. She found herself lingering in the yard some time, while the final reckoning question lingered at the back of her mind. The campaign's excitement had surged during the nights spent watching the fence line for indications of a suspicious person, but every lull warned her that not all conflicts are swift or definitive. Others are fought by taking steady, determined actions to establish justness in the face of fear or indifference. Denny's presence alone showed how. If a blind, 3-legged dog could learn to overcome hurdles and meet strangers, that perseverance could be unstoppable. Wagging his tail and staying steadfast in his devotion to a caregiver who once discovered him on the verge of death. Then, for the sake of the larger good, they could also overcome fear, and Lily accepted herself for. The final act's arrival date and form are undetermined. It might be a public hearing or an official hearing, maybe a more subdued legal settlement or the unveiling of the breeders. No grand showdown at all. Only a gradual disappearance of the offenders, eclipsed by Denny's story. She experienced an unwavering calm, a living testament that no life is too broken or flawed to be cherished. As he lay stretched at her feet, she stood in her dark living room, caressing his soft fur while whispering promises in a voice that only he could hear. "We've come too far. I won't allow them to touch you again." The last strands of the story were ready to come together in that silence of acceptance, and each day an unstoppable wave of community support and interest in the investigation between advanced and people who previously rejected Denny. Soon, blind and legless will have to face the repercussions of their callous deed. The slow GR toward potential justice persisted in the backdrop of Lillian's everyday existence, which was almost unreal in its meticulous silence. After assembling witness accounts, Andrea and the Humane Society's investigator attempted to track down the operations of the alleged breeders. Lillian carried on with her daily activities with Denny. She still arrived home from work to that energetic wagging tail, the gentle nudge, as if nothing had changed, of a muzzle that assured her she was secure in this tiny home where a three-legged blind dog had fallen in love with everything. But there was a pervasive tension that made her days seem like they were approaching a pivotal point for each of them. When Andrea called to provide an update, it appeared that there were two ex-veterans from a suspected breeding outfit had hesitantly revealed how puppies weren't suitable for sale, were covertly deleted, but one reference struck a spooky chord with a blind. Although there was no concrete evidence of the similarities to Denny's case, a dog missing a leg was discovered close to Orchard Fields. Lillian was divided between being excited by the prospect of holding someone and feeling that the case was too precise to ignore. Responsible and fear that these revelations could lead to reprisals. Denny was unaware of the growing drama made significant strides in his own development after speaking with another dog owner with special needs, created a system of tactile markers in the backyard using textured little raised bumps fixed at intervals along the fence line with rope. She spent a few weeks helping Denny commit these marks to memory so he could measure distances more precisely without initially requiring continuous verbal instructions. He boldly went around the yard by himself, stopping only when anew. Lillian felt tears prickle her eyes when a corner was indicated by the roughness beneath her feet. She had discovered a shivering, almost lifeless puppy years prior, and that same dog now had a. In the midst of this silent victory, she hardly dared dream for the sense of independence that the local communities, her neighbors, who had previously viewed her yard with suspicion, continued to be supportive. Delivered by little presents, candies, or chew toys, unloading them on her porch with humble remarks. Some did it without identifying themselves, wishing to interrupt, but Lillian saw the warmth that was blooming as kids occasionally reached over the. When the fence called softly to Denny, he answered with an inquisitive sniff or a wag, even the brief. The favorable coverage of Denny's tale on social media had eclipsed the negative remarks, growing criticism about unethical breeding, but Lillian remained vigilant. She confirmed that the damaged pickup truck that was allegedly lurking around had been seen once more close to Orchard Road. Every night, she made sure that the fences and locks on her property were safe and looked for any unauthorized footprints, informed the local police of every rumor, and the on-duty investigating officer reassured her that they were monitoring questionable activities, but there was still no specific justification for an arrest. In recent weeks, there had been indications of direct threats or forced entry, but she was apprehensive when a twig broke after dark, as though the tension in Lillian's world required more complication. An experienced reporter from a bigger metropolitan newspaper contacted the reporter, who discovered Denny's story via several rescue websites, suggested an in-depth piece examining. Denny is a prime illustration of the forgotten tragedies that underlie some breeding techniques, and Andrea is always the strategist thought this might be a crucial push to get local officials to take action before more dogs. Lillian hesitated as she recalled how hostile words were sparked by the recent media explosion, but as she looked upon Denny, who was sleeping on the floor of her living room in a patch of sunlight, came to the conclusion that on a clear morning, spotlight was worth the danger if it meant destroying the vicious network that had previously denounced him. The camera followed the journalist when he arrived, fully prepared to spend the day documenting Denny's life as it actually is. Initially tripping a little before deftly adapting to the layout of the yard and reacting to Lillian's signal for arrival, and even attempting to use his prosthetic brace for a brief practice session during it all. The reporter questioned him directly about the weeks and months after her discovery of the vile email. Lillian responded to the possible legal developments by dusk in a careful but truthful manner. Hours of footage and a notebook full of quotations about heartbreak were taken with the journalist. That night, resilience and a hint of righteous rage seemed oddly melancholy to Lillian, as if she had spent her whole life sitting with Denny and caressing his gentle ears. She said, "We may be about to undergo more significant changes, buddy. Let's hope that the original breeder was." She feared that they might be provoked by this next round of publicity, either by frightening them into hiding or... She shuddered at the prospect of making a last stand, but after seeing Denny's, reminding her that she had no right to quit if she avoided conflict, the trusting expression asked how many more Denny's would be dismissed as anticipated. After the story was published on internet caused a stir in the local media, and readers gorged themselves on the information. The idea of dishonest breeders condemning puppies at birth in contrast to a dog that recovered from blindness and a missing leg to lead a happy life. The tone of the features was unmistakably critical of anyone who called animals flawed. Lillian's mailbox was inundated with pointless encouragement, but so were anxious letters from rescue allies reminding. She replied with a confidence she wasn't totally sure she had in spite of the possibility of reprisals. "Denny and I are not leaving. We have finished hiding." A few days later, a new message arrived. "We can see from her email that you haven't learned to be quiet and keep an eye on yourself." She felt the. She immediately forwarded it to Andrea and the local police, reminding them of the earlier threat, with ice in her veins. Knowing that the shady network felt threatened confirmed to her that she had come too far to be silenced. That, in fact, she was hitting the mark, whereas the humane societies. Before beginning a case, the investigator spoke with a sympathetic assistant district attorney, forming, even if key pieces of evidence were still elusive. One evening, Lillian was on a video chat with figuring out how the orchard sightings and Denny's microchip information might fit into the chronology. Every discussion suggested that if they could remain steadfast in the face of intimidation, justice would soon be served. Throughout it all, Denny continued to be the calm focal point of the storm on occasion. In a section of the yard he knew well, she would see him pause as if he were listening for something beyond human, hearing a soft tail wag, and he would keep moving forward with assurance. His spirit radiated an unrelenting light despite the blindness and the missing limb. Lillian adhered to the unspoken message, no matter how dire the danger. Smart people who attempted to stifle the truth could succeed via tenacity, kindness, and perseverance. The arc of their tale was bending toward them, even if it took another year for another round of nerve-wracking revelations. Vengeance for Denny and all animals that have experienced the heartache of being called useless. Therefore, with that, Lily embraced her faith, which was silently alive in her bosom, and decided to see this through whatever the upcoming days and weeks would bring. Battle to the end, wherever that may lead. When the early winter chill descended over Lillian's area, when she and Denny went outside in the mornings, her breath created little clouds in the chilly air, creating a brittle silence. The boards of her porch were covered with frost and air. It seemed as if everyone was holding their breath for a last, revealing the intricate network of secrets that had constrained Denny's destiny in the meantime. The only thing the dog did to acknowledge the changing of the seasons was to lift his nose to the cold breeze, as if his curiosity wasn't stifled by his inability to see and his enjoyment of every new aroma. During the weeks, Lillian made fun of him by saying that he was more daring than dogs twice his size and without any handicap. The Humane Society's campaign against the alleged breeders appeared to gain momentum once the investigative report went public. Every few days, Traction Andrea would call with brief updates on progress. Heard other former workers who had seen puppies with birth defects being ruthlessly thrown away digital. Hints that these organizations had connections outside of their immediate area. Every time Lillian spoke with Andrea, her heartbeat quickened with each action done to shed light on that. Darkness seemed to run the risk of inciting retaliation as well, but she refused to give up because she had dedicated her life to protecting Denny, and now it seemed the opportunity to defend other creatures that might be in his situation, but the impending danger of confrontation. Rescue enthusiasts planned a little winter festival in town, which brought some optimism. Families were welcomed by local companies to the event to learn about responsible breeding, adoption, and the joy of special. Requires Pets Lillian decided to take Denny for a visit after some consideration. Brief illustration of his ability to move smoothly with bell cues and light brace prodding. It was a subtle continuation of the mission she and Andrea had begun to educate the people, even on the snow-dusted ground. Community making sure that on the morning of the festival, nobody could use ignorance as a justification for heartless disregard. A hesitant silence descended across the fairgrounds, with kiosks lining the periphery providing cozy. Lillian discovered a peaceful spot to make handcrafted crafts, refreshments, and rescue brochures. Denny set up a tiny presentation space while wearing a tight dog jacket to protect. Off the Cool stood quietly by her side, and the chill kids carefully approached. He replied to their parents, who were whispering that this was the miracle dog they had seen in films and papers, with the same taciturn acquiescence that had come to define him, stopping to inhale or rest his head against him. Reached out to watch him negotiate the fresh snow. Ears alert to the faint chime of the bell Lillian was carrying. Was a modest wonder to many onlookers. But there was a slight tension running through the festival. Lillian observed some strange people hovering around the borders, not interacting, just observing their stares with a. Despite the event's pleasant spirit, a woman wearing a thick parka kept turning away any time. Another Sarah man, stooped in a gray sweatshirt, appeared to be pacing the booths as Lillian's eyes attempted to meet his. She didn't pause to speak, but she felt more than she saw, a predatory alertness that made her stomach turn as she brought up the existence of these silent onlookers who had come to assist Andrea. Andrea's lips pressed into a. She whispered that we should remain vigilant inside an hour, since they might be the same people that delivered you the threat. Hour. But a larger disturbance caused the silence of concern, and the local Humane Society's investigators courted. When a uniformed officer unexpectedly showed up at the event, they wore grave expressions and hurried to find Lillian. When they were out of earshot, the cop whispered, "Andrea, I need a word," and pushed them behind one of the booths. Curious bystanders were informed by the investigator that a batch of texts had emerged as a key piece of evidence. Communications from a source involved in the alleged breeder's business that essentially acknowledged throwing out litters with flaws. They felt it was sufficient to get warrants, or at the very least, compel an official inquiry that could lead. Accusations of animal abuse. Lillian felt her heart thumping in her ears as they were preparing for the possibility of actual accountability. Yet the officer included a. Be advised that they can try to intimidate us by deleting or concealing documents in response. You keep your guard up in a wave of relief since you and Denny's narrative have been so crucial in exposing this. Andrea nodded seriously, understanding the risk and settling the worry in Lillian's breast. We are prepared for whatever it takes, replied. Yet her tense lull abruptly revealed her anxiety due to her clamped jaw. Across the fairgrounds, a group of festival attendees had burst into a flurry of activity that caught their attention. Crying, Lillian hurried past a group of vendor tables with her gut knotted, only to see Denny motionless in the midst of a small group of people, apparently upsetting one of the strangers. There was no sign of the woman in the parka or the man in the hoodie, and the air was filled with a nervous, uneasy tension. The volunteer rushed over and said they had saw a hooded figure come at Denny, seemingly threatening to grab or poke him. But a caution was yelled by witnesses, and the stranger ran away after Denny rattled and barked in. His eyesight and lost limb rendered him particularly susceptible to unexpected interference that quelled her rage. The bystanders dispersed as Lillian knelt and gently stroked Denny's flank, reassuring him. Andrea came breathless, sighing over the missing stranger and sifting through the crowd to assume that someone had attempted to frighten Denny or take him, and they both understood the likely importance of the danger. Breeders may be there. This wasn't a coincidence. Rather, It seemed like a last-ditch effort to make a distorted assertion or undermine Denny's positive story. The silence that followed was filled with mixed feelings of relief that Denny Fury was unharmed by anyone who dared to. The police officer and investigator swiftly brought him into a corner in a public place while their determination was strong. According to accounts from witnesses, Leland led Denny away from the throng and into a peaceful area. As she felt his trembling lessen her own willpower, she moved behind a booth where he could breathe in a calmer setting, confirmed that they had seriously miscalculated if they were attempting to intimidate her into silence. The event went on despite the near conflict, but the innocence was shattered. With Andrea's assistance, Lillian wrapped up her demonstration early and packed things while the last glances from passers-by were not only filled with appreciation as the policeman kept watch for Denny, but a common outrage that someone would wish to disturb a dog who had already conquered so much. And so as Leland and Andrea learned a painful lesson from the showdown they had long anticipated as they traveled home, appeared to be the circle behind it, and it was closer than ever with fresh proof ready to expose the cruelty ring, was acting in a desperate manner, but the ferocious blaze of enduring assurance outweighed the spark of fear inside Lillian. That Denny story would not be controlled by those who rejected him at birth. His tenacious perseverance and his supporters were creating a momentum that could not be stopped by a single threat or fear tactic. Following the eerie attempt at the festival, Lillian's thoughts were troubled every time she relived the event. The shadowy figure vanishing into the crowd and Denny's nervous yelp caused her heart to race with a new wave of rage. After 5 years of raising this kind and tough dog, and now when fear tactics threatened to topple everything, yet justice was within reach, held on to the help of Andrea, the Humane Society in the area, and a growing number of people who shared Denny's narrative, she sat by the ancient recliner in her living room that night, where Denny was peacefully splayed out, putting her palm to his side, as if to soothe him from the idea of his original owners or their spies could still view him as disposable or even valuable in a twisted way, which made Lillian sick to her stomach. The idea that they could have tried to kidnap him in public was unreal and made Lillian's stomach turn. It was unbelievable that they may have tried to kidnap him in public, but it also showed how desperate they were. Those breeders may be if the impending investigation continued to. She was grounded by Denny's presence, and the dog's dependable size served as a reminder of what they had previously conquered, a blind. A dog that had lost a leg had not only lived but flourished, educating others about the spirit's defiance. She made sensible changes and placed a basic security camera close to her porch because she was determined not to live in dread, and set up extra lighting in the garden. Some neighbors, infuriated by the festival's announcement, offered to keep watch during odd hours in case a car that seemed suspicious drives by. Their solidarity reassured her outside the warmth of group support, despite a chilly wind rustling through the changing leaves, shielded Lillian from the icy idea that she would be fighting a vicious circle by herself as the days became tight. The breeding investigation's progress accelerated this week, and Andrea gave the local authorities cautious hope. Gathering had started because of the potential connection between their established disposal techniques and Denny's recorded rescue. Eventually, additional tipsters surfaced, some of whom shared tragically similar stories of discovering damaged puppies left in outlying fields. It appeared that if everything lined up, a formal attack or series of arrests could happen soon. Lillian experienced a mixed sense of eagerness, longing for the day justice came, but he was well aware that danger would still lurk until it did. Despite all of this stress, her mornings and nights were still brightly colored by her routine with Denny. He kept honing his sense-based navigation skills, leaping through the home with startling precision under the guidance of the various floor mats' faint bristles and the rhythmic cues Lillian added. He would prick his ears as she held up a tiny jingle bell in the kitchen as he trotted in at a self-assured angle that almost looked alike, and every session gave her hope that she couldn't stop envisioning how a lot of heartache could be avoided if dishonest breeders stopped throwing away puppies with purported flaws. Denny's exuberance was a living testament to the idea that all living things should have the opportunity to. Officer Ryan, One of the locals was on a cool day when the sun was low in the sky. Standing in Lillian's little living room, law enforcement officers arrived with an update. The officer clarified that, while nothing was finalized, they were completing the specifics of a planned attack on the suspected breeder's property. Hearing that there were in-stone indications of a massive operation that might have included several states left Lillian speechless. She had anticipated harshness, but not such a vast network. Her gaze shifted to Denny, who was happily relaxing on his favorite rug. But without realizing it, his predicament had yanked a thread that might untangle a much more extensive web of maltreatment via the. She had a steely certainty that the day of reckoning was approaching, and the weight of that knowledge was heavy. A few days later, when Lillian and Andrea got a covert tip that word had leaked, the creeping resolution became more intense. Alerted the breeders regarding a planned bust, and their associates were frantically deleting digital data and moving. They were terrified that the breeders would attack, confront, or silence anyone who had assisted in their exposure. Lillian braced for the potential of a direct confrontation, checking her security cameras twice, and having an affair with her. With the phone nearby, she made an effort to maintain her composure for Denny's sake as they continued their regular routine of taking moderate strolls. Despite her attention to detail and the puzzle feeders that enhanced his keen sense of smell, an uncomfortable serenity descended as. Even though darkness was approaching every night, she looked for any silhouettes in the brightness of the street lights. That wasn't appropriate. The nights went by without any incidents. Only the silence of a peaceful neighborhood. Possibly the threat was, she reasoned, more bluster than truth. Or perhaps the breeders were cornered by. Nevertheless, facing the caregiver of a single dog was not the top priority due to the imminent legal repercussions. As a warning that safety was precarious, tension buzzed through her head. The local Humane Society received a call from Andrea on a clear morning, which made Lillian's heart race. Discovered that on that day, a multi-agency team would serve warrants on the suspected breeders if it was successful, it could break the chain that had previously judged Denny to be worthless. Lillian felt a mixture of relief and relief. Dread and Denny roamed the yard while they awaited more updates from the autumn sun. Brilliant, but unable to thaw the icy anticipation in her bones in the middle of the afternoon. Another call came in, this time full of a controlled triumph. The raid had been successful. Documents found by officials indicated that many puppies that were judged unsellable were disposed of. As she took in the information, Lillian fell onto her doorstep and arrests were made. Steps, a sense of comfort washed over her, and she turned to see Denny walking over the grass, led by the sharp. The sound of her voice drew the leaves beneath her feet, and she caressed his velvety ears. Her eyes were misted with a whirl of appreciation as she whispered that justice was finally coming for those who had rejected him. No quick reference to Denny's original owners surfaced from the tears of gentle release of pent-up anxiety. Preliminary information, but according to the official statement, some breeders engaged in synergistic exchanges. Puppies, and throwing away those with birth abnormalities if the inquiry confirmed a. Lillian's collection of evidence could help close the loop by providing a link to the orchard fields where Denny had been discovered. Remember the report of a black van from the battered orchard? Those eerie pictures seemed to belong to someone else. Lifetime eclipsed by the blind dog before her, who had turned into a symbol of. Resilience muted Lillian's mood even when victory appeared inevitable. Even with legal advancements, convictions may take months, and retaliation was always a possibility. Andrea told her that she should continue to take precautions against people who are still at large until. As the court proceedings calmed, Lillian consented to represent Denny, who remained her first objective and approached every new day with unrelenting positivity. But today, for the first time, she felt that the shadow of uncertainty was a bit less threatening. That Denny's right to exist outside the boundaries was solidly supported by the community, the rescue network, and even the law. In the silence of that winter afternoon, she permitted cruelty or heartless profit. She took a minute to relax while gently comforting Denny by caressing his fur. That karma had taken its time, but had finally come, and that the ghost of his terrible beginning might soon be resting, creating a web of repercussions for people who thought a three-legged blind puppy had no place in the world and in the Denny was the living evidence at its center, modest yet unbreakable. That kindness may grow, thrive, and ultimately triumph, even in the most exploitative places. As she spread out Denny's morning meal, the stark winter sun crept across Lillian's kitchen floor, appearing to have lightened. By hearing about the previous raid, but the investigator from the Humane Society had warned that a court case might continue for months or even years. She was unable to ignore the slight sense of comfort that come from realizing that the specter of Denny's had cornered the dishonest breeders for the first time in 5 years. Early abandonment seemed less like an impending danger and more like a situation that was still moving toward true closure. Closure never came easily. A few days following the arrests, Lillian was given a preliminary. In a calm, businesslike voice, the investigating officer's caller stated that specific records found throughout the search mentioned a blind, three-legged whelp that corresponded to the approximate time, and the breeder's notes contained a somber reference to disposed of animals, but no name at the spot where Denny was discovered. Wasn't the kind of designation that gave clear ownership boundaries, but it did depict the operations. Classified animals that were thought to be unprofitable, and the revelation left Lillian Reiner. She had always suspected something similar, so she wasn't shocked to find it validated in official documents. Made it clear how heartless the industry could be. She hung up with a queasy sensation. Clutched Denny's muzzle met her, as he sensed her strain against her leg. Fingers causing her to bend down and give him a hug while caressing his ears, she whispered, assurance. But it was more for her own comfort than his, and the phrase disposed stock stuck in her head. That same afternoon, Andrea dropped by with a heartbreaking testament to the mindset that had almost brought Denny to his demise. Update from the legal team of the Humane Society. She clarified that while the seizure paperwork clearly suggested the breeders had rejected puppies such as Denny, the case depended on demonstrating this particular gang was to blame for his predicament. Our best hope, Andrea, stated that the best way to push is to do so quietly. Denny Lillian nodded in agreement for a more comprehensive cruelty accusation that includes unidentified or unrecorded animals. Although there was little concrete evidence that Denny was from them, his story may still be heard in court, highlighting the damage done to crippled puppies in any case. Andrea came to the conclusion that Denny's life presence conveys a strong message that, in the midst of things, you cannot simply throw away a life and expect no repercussions. Everyday life went on with unexpected normalcy, and Denny appeared happy. And he occasionally hobbled around the backyard at a jog, unaware of the legal complications that were all around him. Lillian still took him for a little while he was stumbling across a patch of winter sunlight, as if savoring every little comfort. Walks cautiously on ice sidewalks, aware of the potential consequences of slipping. Actual harm. Occasionally neighbors she hardly knew would smile and wave from their porches when they saw a local symbol of hope. The miracle dog's brief actions were a wave of encouragement. Lillian caught a sight of the neighbor's youngsters squealing into the light, demonstrating how completely Denny had flipped the story. Animals with special needs in their community. And in a twist of fate, she hadn't anticipated one of the recently detained breeders, associates the Peace P. riddled, was interviewed by a local news site. The skewed perspective was presented by the use of defensive rhetoric, which asserted that some were. The interview further stated that none of the breeders should be held accountable for what they. Lillian felt her hands as she read it, which was described as practical business. She shuddered at the casual brutality, which echoed the discarded stock label. She realized that such cynicism was difficult for reason to destroy, but she also experienced a silent but powerful outburst of rage. If Denny had taught her anything, it was that empathy held the key to having the strength to overcome even the most profound pessimism. Lillian reached out to the reporter who had covered Denny in death weeks earlier, asked for a follow-up to address the breeders' practical justifications, emphasized the love and resiliency that had grown in the area where the journalist agreed that greed expected nothing but waste, and in a few days, an passionate editorial that surfaced online, striking a striking contrast between the dreariness of those protective assertions and actual photos of. The piece concluded with Denny leaping across a snowy yard while wagging his peaked tail. A harsh conclusion, How many other dogs could so completely reject the notion that being flawed meant being worthless? Eliminating the idea that harmful thinking reactions were quick could save lives. While many social media users praised the editorial, other pessimists returned, branding Lillian naive. But a chorus of pity overshadowed their words. Lillian was informed by the investigating officer that the breeders will soon face legal action, could desire her testimony or even Denny's presence if it highlighted the brutality of the. She acknowledged that it looked intimidating to bring a blind, three-legged dog into a courtroom, but she decided to give it some thought. If it assisted in obtaining convictions, while the fear of potential reprisals lingered in the background. Every time she left her typical routine or remained out later than she had planned, she felt a burning ember. A warning, but unfortunately, the more widely shared Denny's story became the best disinfectant for uncovering wrongdoing in a situation was sunlight, which seemed to intensify less likely shadows' dangers. Way that made confidentiality challenging. Lillian silently gave herself permission to hope that the one chilly, bright morning, the worst had happened, and there would be no more attempts to threaten her or hurt Denny. When a letter from a different state came in her mailbox, she discovered after hearing Denny's story, a man who had adopted a special needs dog wrote a poignant comment saying that he was struck by how he was motivated to adopt a dog without both hind legs because he saw how love and commitment could change a difficult puppy. As the letter came to an end, Lillian's eyes filled with tears. She has taught me more about resilience than I ever thought. As she imagined another animal growing in a medical setting, she saw another example of what an underdog could. She let Denny sniff the edges of the letter, clutching it to start a chain reaction of hope. Slowly, as she became aware of the extent of his impact, amidst these glimmers of advancement, the route to the. While the Humane Society acquired additional information, the breeder's attorneys continued to produce bland rejections in the final reckoning. Andrea cautioned that there was evidence that a judicial hearing or protracted legal disputes would occur. Be quick or simple, but Lillian didn't feel the need to hurry at every calm time. Denny's satisfied sigh served as a reminder to her that justice just required patience and steadfast willpower, started by the incredible fortitude of a small dog that overcame insurmountable circumstances was gaining speed. Though the conclusion wasn't certain, Lillian felt like a sluggish but unstoppable tide, stood prepared to face whatever happened next, guided by a lowly dog who saw that nothing was missing a leg, but every dawn seemed to. 2 months after the arrests, to face the world with unwavering optimism. Charges were filed, marking a turning point in the judicial process against the suspected breeders, relying largely on a pattern of abandonment and maltreatment, with many specifics still being kept secret. The Humane Societies. An investigator verified reports that a number of really ill animals had been saved from the breeders' grounds. Although the investigators were unable to confirm the origin of each dog at the time of the raid, the existence of records pertaining to discarded stock, such as pups with missing or blind limbs, stood as proof of a methodical approach. It was a sobering triumph that highlighted the cruelty of that environment, as well as the tenacity of creatures like Denny as the case progressed. When called upon, Lillian was ready to testify, having carefully prepared her binder, gathered notes, veterinarian data, time frames, and unexpected testimonies from rescue personnel, held weight as she struggled with ambivalence, a desire to see justice done that was tempered by public fear. Sometimes she had nightmares about possible retaliation and speaking, swirling with pictures of a dark car lurking outside her house, or a spooky figure snatching Denny and vanishing into the night. But every dawn, she told Ed herself that fear wouldn't stop her from feeding the dog, who had previously defied so many doubters. Whatever her decisions, Denny, for his own, kept thriving under the cool normalcy Lillian gave him. On the Saturday morning, she led him to a recently renovated area of the backyard where a little wooden ramp had been implanted, making it simpler for his missing leg to move between levels. As soon as she let him, Denny hopped, moving forward with eager resolve, smelling the platform's edges, and then using that odd combination of caution and. He approached the slope with audacity, navigating each step with sniffs and a few hesitant paw scrapes. Lillian cheered quietly as he made it to the top, panting, But scenes of victory like this served as a reminder to her that even while the legal saga continued to exist in real life, Denny's life developed in small milestones that, honoring the small achievements that went beyond the yard boy by local. Lillian brought Denny to a small therapy dog group out of interest and at the suggestion of a helpful friend. Despite Denny's lack of formal certification, Bells was impressed by his kind disposition and responsiveness. After a month of closely monitored visits, even the group's seasoned trainers earned the organizers' trust enough to invite him to events at a local senior center where, for the first time, residents took comfort in petting his smooth ears and admiring his unflappable serenity. Lillian witnessed how Denny's struggles resulted in a special solace for others. If a three-legged blind dog could embrace every day with unflinching optimism, so that those who are battling aging or disease can find hope in there. Naturally, not everyone accepted Denny's outreach every now and then. A sarcastic comment on the internet or a somber rumor that the breeder's associates still wandered around. But these noises were progressively overpowered by the silent awe of people who witnessed Denny's presence at medical facilities, educational institutions, or, as evidence of the tenacity that animals provide, he may trip or stop to orient himself at retirement homes when unfamiliar noises filled the new environment. But constant sweetness led the way. Visitors were captivated by his intangible sense of acceptance and unconditional kindness in every connection. Acknowledged that his limitations weren't the core of who he was. While Andrea provided regular updates from she disclosed that the prosecution was undecided about whether to use Denny as a symbolic victim in the continuing inquiry. A prospective trial was concerned that it would cause a courtroom emotional reaction. Although Lillian found it repulsive to parade him about like an exhibit, she nevertheless acknowledged the ability to display a live, abandoned puppy that had developed into a symbol of strength. She finally informed Andrea that if the attorneys thought that Denny's presence would guarantee a conviction against the offenders, so she would cooperate with the thought of escorting him into a sterile courtroom where vigilant eyes would be watching her sat uncomfortably in her chest as the months. The local DA's office hinted at a plea as the case's swirl of tension started to change on the eve of spring. If the breeder's lawyers acknowledged the strength of the evidence that may expedite the process, a deal might be possible. Some in the rescue community viewed sentence as a way to ensure the organization was dissolved without a drawn-out trial. Leland struggled with a bittersweet compromise, which meant fewer days in court, but maybe milder punishments. A part of her wished to see people who almost condemned Denny for the moral dilemma, strongest consequences, and on a particularly brisk morning. Another part simply wanted them to shut down regardless of the details. After feeding Denny, she found herself reading the most recent news article on her phone while sitting on the porch. The primary operator of the breeder had reportedly made references to assisting the authorities in return for fewer charges. Although the excerpt was unverified, it supported the theory that a plea agreement was imminent. Lillian discovered no delight in that idea, but instead of feeling a cozy sense of vengeance, she felt a muted relief that, despite the final hammer of justice's lack of drama, the cycle of cruelty might be broken. Would have hoped for, but the karma dilemma persisted. Was there any resolution found in a brief term and a tacit plea deal? Maybe cosmic justice didn't always arrive as a loud disclosure in a courtroom, but instead, the loneliness is brought about by a million tiny changes. Those breeders were suddenly confronted by an enraged community, but the message spread thanks to the supportive circle that gathered around Denny. Every small change on social media chipped away at the belief that no animal was useless due to a disability. Mentality that, after being called Denny, threw out stock every day, marking the end of the pack's reign. Lillian saw the absence of fresh victims as a kind of retaliation, and as a result, she was engulfed in. During these fluctuating tides, she rose from the porch to meet Denny, who joyfully trotted across the yard under the gentle guidance of. He pushed Cal, who had a bell fastened to her waist, as if to urge her to live in the now and not worry about the. She bent to scratch behind his ears, amazed as always by the unchanging faith shining through the larger legal swirl. From eyes that only saw shadows, regardless of how the case ultimately turned out, a trial and a plea deal, or Denny's story had already changed the trajectory of many lives, including her own, for Lillian. Every little step he made, and every wag of his tail, was a genuine measure of karma, silent evidence that kindness never dies, and even flourishes in places where brutality and neglect once threatened to destroy an innocent life, despite the initial indication that the case against the dishonest breeders would soon come to an end on a pleasant spring afternoon. Throughout the previous months, Lillian had seen as the Stark left the orchard fields. Winter's frosty hold gave way to emerging trees and new green shots. In some way, the scene of Denny's near-death experience suddenly glowed with new life. The last moments of a legal drama that she and Denny had unintentionally acted out were reflected in seasonal rejuvenation. On that particular day, a courier brought a simple envelope to Lillian's. A summons for a private hearing rather than a formal trial was placed inside the door, where, according to Andrea, the breeder's attorneys, a judge would take into account a plea deal, had struck an agreement to exchange confessions of guilt in order to avoid a drawn-out jury trial on several charges of animal abuse, seeking a lighter sentence. When Lillian read the information, that made her stomach turn, but she had waited for a spectacular courtroom confrontation and a loud denunciation in which Denny's tale would reverberate in the whispered hallways of those who had previously dismissed him as throwaway. But the documents stated out something more subdued. The offenders would commit misconduct, pay hefty fines, and consent to a permanent suspension from. Although probable, breeding jail time was not assured for a single night. Lillian discovered that many puppies had perished or been abandoned. Denny, and she was caught between grudging acceptance and brewing rage, had been one fortunate survivor. But if this agreement terminated their operations, perhaps they could save other creatures from suffering the same fate. She was so uneasy that she paced the living room floor as Denny slept beneath a window. He breathed softly, his blind eyes half closed in blissful comfort, discovered a gentle reminder of their progress, and how unlikely it was that he would have survived at all. Helped her to understand that the purpose of the hearing was to prevent cruelty rather than seek personal retribution. The small courtroom where Lillian came was surrounded by a muted silence. She decided not to bring Denny into the crowded area, even though she was early with Andrea and the Humane Society investigator, and the strained environment proved to be too stressful for him. Instead, she brought pictures and a well-worn binder with details. The defense lawyers shuffled papers at a large table, avoiding eye contact with his medical records and rescue timetable. A woman in her 40s and two men from the breeders sat in a row next to them, radiating. Their expressions were nondescript, displaying a mixture of resignation and subdued defiance. Lillian found it strangely unnerving that such common people could plan. The Judge Gray's meticulous acceptance of the systematic dumping of puppies, reading each charge in a reasonable tone, plea bargains, negligence, and abandonment, conspiracy to avoid payments related to basic licensing and veterinary examinations that worrisomely. Despite never mentioning Denny by name, the defendants acknowledged that they recognized the admissions of inhumanity. Lillian felt uneasy at the mention of crippled puppies. Therefore, she refrained from speaking or testifying that day. The deal was mostly set, but she saw the Humane Society investigator's eyes flutter a silent admission that the pressure that led to this moment outside had been fueled in part by Denny's presence. After that, a few reporters gathered at the courthouse to record footage for local stations, and Andrea motioned for. Given how crucial her dog's case had been, Lillian would like to make a quick comment. Lillian walked forward, steeling herself, the cameras angled toward her, and she said calmly and measuredly that today isn't about me or even my dog in particular, but rather about realizing that no animal that is blind, missing a limb, or otherwise considered flawed should be thrown away. I'm glad these breeders are being held responsible, but I will never forget the unnamed puppies who were never able to find protection. Before tears could reveal the whirlpool of relief and grief tangled inside her in the moment, she turned away and left it there. The official sentence in the ensuing weeks had conflicting outcomes for the breeders. Obtained fines sufficient to cover their operations, a permanent prohibition on breeding, and a brief but ringleaders required jail term. No amount of punishment could make up for the cruelty committed. but at least a rare victory was established in court documents, which could discourage others from pursuing such a brutal technique. Yes, it's not the huge moral victory we had hoped for, but it's actual action that Andrea called Lillian with a weak giggle. Oddly, as the dust settled, Lillian discovered that she was floating in a calm. She became acutely aware of how profoundly the quest had shaped her recent months, like the silence after a storm. Of this conflict was now overwhelmed by a sense of peaceful finality instead of. Denny sniffed excitedly as the grand display in her yard filled with pleasant scents from the spring blossoms. He was as happy as ever in the land she was in, with each fence post and nose attuned to new growth. Had carved for him. You did it. Supporters' silent messages trickled in. Denny's helped preserve more canines, some of whom were from families who had recently adopted special needs puppies. Internet story for demonstrating to them the potential of each message, which verified that justice had adopted a quiet form. Its effects were felt well beyond a particular court or dog. One late afternoon, Lillian was sitting on the porch stairs when she heard Denny sleeping next to her. The distant orchard fields were glowing in the gentle sunlight. She reflected that it was no longer a sign of sadness, but rather a monument to a life that had been cast aside and was now completely claimed. To the puppy's initial shaky days, the evenings she doubted her capacity to bring up a dog who was born blind and crippled by 3 legs, a flood of appreciation for every tiny victory swept over her each. With the help of chime-based commands, he was able to master every unfavorable forecast. His steadfast spirit allowed him to not only survive, yet flourished in doing so, revealing a thread of empathy that led to a soft bark drew her from her reverie, and Denny's ears perked rows in the community to consider their position on canines like him. She patted his side, his voice catching, as if to remind her of the reality of the moment. Okay, she whispered quietly, her eyes straying to what I believe to be the orchard horizon. Finally, we are aware that the phrase was both a pledge and an observation made by karma. Perhaps not with the loud bang of a gavel or lengthy phrases, but rather with the invisible change of viewpoints and the silent demise of people who thought a handicapped puppy was worthless as night fell, Lillian persuaded. Denny locked up inside with the understated ease of someone who was no longer overcome by fear. The warm glow of the feeding station had been painstakingly modified, and the lights in the living room showed the battered dog toys strewn across the rug. This was their solution for Denny's specific demands, and the walls were covered in pictures showing 5 years of unlikely growth. A haven created with love and patience. Tomorrow would bring them regular meals and shorter training sessions. Perhaps a stroll around the block if the weather permitted. They had created a life that didn't need any more drama. Disregarded the tragedy script in order to create a safe haven away from the roars of cruelty and terror, and for Lillian, and in fact for any grand theatrical flourish that some may have referred to as justice was overshadowed by Denny's sense of well-earned peace. Was sufficient. Finally, a cool morning sun illuminated the courthouse steps, glow when Lillian showed there with Denny on her side, despite weeks of deliberation over whether to invite him to the final hearing. The prosecutor promised her that this day may prove crucial. The defense team may attempt to minimize the harm done to faulty puppies and a live, breathing dog that is blind from birth, and failing to show up could undermine their assertions of simple commercial acumen. So she was heart-racing, guiding her crippled friend into the intimidating entrance of a legal arena that seemed as alien as any location they had ever been to. Known that the hallways were alive with journalists having uncomfortable conversations, murmured to one another as the camera team quietly positioned themselves in corners, awaiting the judge's approval to video. Andrea and the investigator from the Humane Society waved Lillian in relief. Clearly visible in their eyes, they used their voices and a soft chime to guide Denny across the shiny floor. Momentary wonder mixed with pity at seeing a dog so eager and moving with such cautious dignity in spite of his disabilities. Every time he stumbled on the slippery tiles, Lillian kept a hold on his harness and whispered kind encouragement. Rumor had it that the hearing today would decide whether the breeder's guilty pleas were changed or withdrawn. Rumor said that the defense would make a last-ditch effort to change the story by saying these discarded Lillian's job was to attest to Denny's transition from near-death rejection to feeling unwell beyond treatment. As a healthy adult, she demonstrated the falsity of the breeder's claim of inevitability by remembering. It had taken all the bumps, bruises, and heartaches to get Denny this far into. Two men and a woman were seated at the defense table in the crowded gallery of the courtroom, where she discovered the probable breeders. They never looked at her for longer than a second, as their gaze darted throughout the room. Although she had seen their features in passing during previous procedures, something about their position now made her feel besieged. Lillian wondered how it must be to witness a blind person in desperation if they really thought crippled animals were useless. Waltz, a three-legged dog, is a living example of their moral failings, and the judge is stern. The prosecution started by restating the facts after a woman with steel-gray hair tapped her gavel to call the session to order. The breeders acknowledged that they had put unproductive pups to death or abandoned them. We're requesting a reduced sentence in return for providing more information about connected operations. However, in a turnabout, their counsel suddenly argued that it was impossible to save creatures with serious malformations. Murmurs that suggested no real harm had been done echoed among the onlookers, and Lillian felt outrage flash in. When the prosecutor said she had a rebuttal witness, Leland, Denny's dog caretaker, a silence descended on her chest. Fields stepped forward from the orchard, adjusting the microphone, and Leland swallowed her. Nerves Denny moved next to her the whole time, guided by the gentle tinkling of her bell. Focus went to the dog in the courtroom, whose milky eyes calmly stared at shapes he couldn't see. One leg ended in a clean stump, but he remained calm and confident, putting his trust in the hand at. Clearing her throat, she claimed a room, his collar a quiet deeper than before. The day Denny was discovered sobbing in almost complete famine and floating through a fog of suffering, how his neighbor claimed he would never make it, and how each day he overcame the odds seemed to refute the idea that. She talked of midnight feedings, limited funds, and disabled people being equally disposable. When she explained how he handled life, her voice cracked as she explained that she was teaching Denny to travel solely by sound and scent. Despite missing a leg and never seeing color, with unshakable zeal, she came to the conclusion that no birth abnormality or impairment is a result of light, death sentence, and it's never a justification for throwing away an animal. She looked at the defendants, kept her mouth shut, and the court fell silent as the prosecutor walked up to Denny and allowed him to sniff a gloved hand, confirming that this dog was a real, living case. Even the judge's stern features are molded by compassion rather than cruelty, temporarily mellowed in that silence. The story of the unfit to live fell apart. When cross-examination began, Denny was breathing calmly, and the defense lawyer tried to minimize the importance of one dog's survival. They observed, "He's definitely an anomaly." Condescendingly, is it not possible that the majority of badly malformed animals do not have a robust health or resources you offered? Lillian refused to give up, stating that, with the right care, any dog may be helped. When the lawyer asked, "Would you say you put a lot of time and money into this one case?" she nodded. Unflinchingly, "I did. And because he's still alive and well, I would do it again." From the corner of her eye, the last note sounded with unyielding certainty. There was no obvious breakdown when Lillian watched the principal defendant shake his head and turn to whisper something to his attorney. Or confession, only a quiet strain, but the judge's expression indicated that the defense dropped additional challenges as if the attempt to diminish Denny's existence had failed. Realizing that by abusing a caregiver and her crippled dog after the judge excused her, they would alienate the public's sympathy. Following Lillian's return to her seat from the stand, Denny did the same with the same polite pace, led by her quiet breath of relief as she became aware that she was shaking, and a quick glance across the aisle attracted the suspicious. The silence that followed may have stiffened the breeders' faces as a result of being cornered by the living testament. Felt electric, as if the moral boundaries were quickly acknowledged by the entire court. After a pawn, the hearing ended for the day without a decision being rendered. Punishment would be decided later, but Lillian felt a permanent change, and the defense's delusion had been refuted not by acrimonious arguments, but by the kind presence of a dog that simply by existing, disprove the idea of. As she left the courthouse, Denny walked calmly while useless cameras flashed. Every time her knee clicked, a moment was captured that, perhaps, signaled the end of a brutal philosophy press microphones. Hovered, but she only grinned and muttered that she would wait for the court to speak. As Denny collapsed on his favorite rug at home, the tension subsided, and Lillian noticed him drifting asleep. Simple slumber that the actual climax wasn't a single flaming confrontation, but rather a blind, three-legged dog standing in a location where no one thought he belonged, and the silent, unstoppable reality, disarming a court with his unrepentant existence for the time being that, she whispered, the shining moment of truth was enough, basking in its afterglow. I believe we've succeeded, Denny. You demonstrated your identity to them outside the orchard. As though expressing her sentiment, fields rustled under a gentle wind, and for a dog once, it felt like the culmination of a trip that had transcended all limits, and sunlight was disregarded as too broken to be saved. Cast a gentle golden glow as it passed through the orchard trees close to Lillian's house. Stood in the same field where Denny was found all those years ago, a lattice of light on the ground. Shaky, blind, and legless abandoned puppy. She couldn't help but think back on their convoluted journey. As she observed Denny walk forward with the same plucky and sniff the orchard grass, she gasped. Tenacity that had sustained him throughout his unlikely life. The legal battle against the dishonest. Breeders, who had before had a dim hope, have progressed to the point where no denial or flimsy explanation could conceal the atrocities they had committed during the hearing, where Denny had unintentionally, but crucially played a conclusive, indisputable argument against the idea that any living thing was beyond saving, even though punishment had not yet been decided. The weight of public criticism and the guilty pleas ensured that these breeders would be held accountable for. This victory was sufficient for Lillian to put an end to her earlier, more violent fantasies of retribution justice. It was discovered that it might be both silent and revolutionary at the Denny and she approached the entrance of her tiny home at the same moment. In his ears, Lillian held a soft bell that led him while he prickled at the familiar jingle. Stacks of case-related papers and folders remained on one side of the living room, which appeared to exhale relief. Table is evidence of the past year's chaos. Although she lacked the fortitude to put them in a box, a part of her longed. The tension that had previously pervaded her daily life was still present in that tangible reminder of what they had achieved together. Life seems to have much decreased. She slept more soundly and stopped waking up at midnight to check the locks or looking for hidden dangers in every vehicle that passes by the court's last steps. Even Andrea's calls were kinder, and the sentencing procedure seemed more like an unavoidable formality than a high-stakes drama. More about organizing press final comments or exchanging information than it is about warning of possible danger. Happy news from the local rescue community's Humane Society employees, and a surge of requests from families wishing to adopt special needs animals reinforced the sense of vindication that prevailed. According to Denny's account, he naturally remained blissfully ignorant of legal. However, his everyday worries continued to center on the particulars of mealtime, quick games in the yard, and the excitement of learning new mobility cues, and his skills in navigating the living room and backyard had further improved. Since those final therapy group sessions, he now trotted with unexpected grace to the open porch door, occasionally sticking his head out to look for a fresh patch of grass while beckoning and sniffing for Lillian's presence. Sunshine to assert, or perhaps as a faint reminder of the beginning of his story from the far-off rustle of the orchard trees. Lillian organized a small neighborhood gathering as a beautiful symbolic act, welcomed friends, neighbors, and local rescue volunteers who had silently helped her, and even some members of the district attorney's office who had become enamored with Denny's story, who convened in. Simple yet colorful tablecloths were used to dress the tables in her backyard on a mildly sunny afternoon, and a few kids were present, scampered around, giving the canines in attendance tender pats, while a few more special needs people arrived at one table. Gathered a collection of pictures documenting Denny's life, including the oldest photographs, then pictures of him getting used to a prosthetic brace, and finally the victorious position he had adopted in. Many people saw Denny for the first time in person at the court, and there was a noticeable silence as he negotiated a barrier under the faint ringing of a bell. And he would stop and crane his head as though taking in the texture mats that Lillian had placed out. A little silence, and then repeatedly move forward with hesitancy, yet confidence. "I can't believe how well he does," someone would mutter, combining awe and. The gathering was filled with love as kids approached him carefully, offering him goodies or allowing him to sniff. As the afternoon drew to a close, Lillian's hands felt a profound, brilliant satisfaction. In the expectant hush that Lillian found herself in, a close friend tapped a spoon against a glass, requesting silence. Taking center stage, Denny leaned in her side as she recalled in a steady but filled with passion the unlikely fabric that shaped their history, the orchard fields, the hopelessness of learning how a live being could be deemed disposable, the dog's amazing capacity for adaptation, and ultimately the quiet applause that swept across the courtroom as a result of the public's sympathy for the case. Audience when she explained how Denny's presence had dispelled the misconception that having a disability means doom will kill her. During her brief speech, she looked down at Denny, who ignored the eyes on him and waggled his tail in response to her voice. In that little gesture, unconditional love was shown more beautifully than any father in the crowd could have ever done with words. Wiping away tears while holding a small infant in his arms, a volunteer from the Humane Society smiled at Lillian, as though to convey that this is the reason we continue to fight. That instant, the last line separating triumph and sadness vanished when, as the gathering came to an end, the orchard sunset created long shadows in the yard, and Lillian saw several people leaving. She understood she was saying goodbye by softly ruffling Denny's fur and holding her others. That although the breeders will still face a formal sentencing in the coming weeks, this day felt like the final conclusion. The quiet vengeance that had descended upon those who had previously rejected Denny and the justice that he represented were now. No one who saw this dog's serene presence and constant adoration could not help but feel that it was woven into the community's consciousness. That night, in the silence of her living room, reject him as defective or unworthy. Years before she sat next to him and rested a hand on his, Lillian discovered Denny stretched across the same rug he claimed. Sighed, listening to his breathing's steady, regular pattern perhaps she might have. She was sobbing as she thought back to his little whimpers on the day they first met, but now she could smile at the safe recollection, in the understanding that something was born with each act of devotion and each step on a blind dog's meandering journey. Incredibly good in a world that frequently seemed incredibly uncaring at end. With her heart full of thankfulness, she let herself unwind while the orchard trees danced in the moonlight breeze. And Denny had arrived at the silent pinnacle of their tale, demonstrating that even when faced with challenges of birth, people who believe you are unworthy, you can nevertheless lead a life that is unquestionably valuable. And in that life, albeit modest, had given its ultimate judgment with a kind, unwavering grace. I am grateful for accompanying us on this poignant trip through Denny's incredible tale of adaptation, survival, and eventual justice. We encourage you to support him if his fortitude in the face of infirmity and abandonment has warmed your heart. Please take into consideration our objective to recognize and preserve animals with unique needs. Like this video, spreading Denny's message thus far, and subscribing to our channel. And wide together, we can give every dog who is thought to be flawed a brighter spotlight.